the purported value of the money, unquote, and the land. So, there's a lot of details to be worked out here before you rectify these things. And what it shows is that these guys were thinking about it back then, and that's what's most important. But have they resolved these things out to actual solution? Do we follow them claiming, oh, you have to spend money into circulation? There can be no obligation to pay it out of circulation, which is what we call a debt. No. This is obviously a very unfinished state of work. So if we followed it as a model, it could only be, and were to benefit from it, it could only be very carefully by rectifying all of its deficiencies and flaws, if any. And we've raised quite a few of them already, and we haven't even got to the actual paper. Most modern economists would side with Franklin's critics. The notes were not redeemable in land or any commodity, and nothing, well, that's not really quite true. It's the proportion, though, is completely left out. And maldisposition is completely unaddressed, and it's imposed because we're imposing interest. And nothing limited the quantity of money that land banks might create. Well, I dispute that. If a person wants to pay for land, infinite, of course. But if you had a standard or there was a true free market, the price of land. Land is a kind of a strange thing, but it's sort of a different, thing. But before we get off on that tangent, which we are going to address, let's just go on with this thing and raise a question mark there at least. It is interesting to note, however, that the argument continues on into modern times. Well, how about that argument? Well, it hasn't been resolved in anything. Well, you can say that if you don't know anything about mathematically perfected economy, because is there a solution for inflation and deflation? Well, no one's disproven it yet. Is there a solution for inherent irreversible multiplication of artificial indebtedness? Well, that one's pretty obvious, and the one for inflation and deflation is very obvious as well. Second-grade math. And being as the combination of those two solves systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, there's no reason for this argument to continue on into modern times, except the thing that I'm addressing here, public division. That is, it's not important enough for us to understand these things. You're not going to have to go through this for your whole life. We're going to do three programs here and finish this up where, say in 10 hours, that's a complete education. You don't need to go to college on it, because the whole thing that they're going to teach you there that they call economics is a lie. So it's not like this is, you can be having a glass of wine right now with your feet up and kick back on the couch, and this is not difficult, I hope. Franklin also presented a labor theory of value. That is, he attributed the relative prices of goods to their relative labor inputs. Well, that's a very important principle, and I'm just going to say that much about it so far. This idea was central to classical economics in the early 19th century, and Franklin is sometimes credited with being among the first to advance it. However, William Wetzel argues persuasively in Ben Franklin as an Economist that Franklin lifted his discussion of the labor theory of value from Sir William Petty's treatise on taxes and contributions. Okay, so it might not have been original, but in truth, I'm just going to say this much so far. If you think about that proposition that relative prices of goods is related to whatever goes into producing them, that is what we contribute to that. This is a principle that we actually follow ourselves naturally in determining the right price of everything. Now, in today, what we call capitalism, that proposition is blown out of the water. Not that it's wrong, but we depart from it, because the idea of unearned gain, profiting without labor, as it inherently, all the wealth that exists is just what's produced by labor. All unearned profit, therefore, infringes upon the ability of what we used to call free enterprise to receive justly for its labor. You see, capitalism and true free enterprise are mutually exclusive. That's a very important thing for us to understand. But what this tells us is that Franklin is thinking that direction. And so were many other people in that day. And now today, in all this divorce from principle, we are suffering the consequences of what is actually ruin the possibility of actual free enterprise. So this is his paper, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency. He says, there is no science, the study of which is more useful and commendable than the knowledge of the true interest of one's country. And perhaps there is no kind of learning more abstruse and intricate, more difficult to acquire in any degree of perfection than this, and therefore none more generally neglected. Hence it is that we, every day, find men in conversation contending warmly on some point in politics, which although it may nearly concern them both, neither of them understand any more than they do each other. That's pretty astute there, you know. Thus much by way of apology for this present inquiry into the nature and necessity of a paper currency. And if anything I shall say may be a means of fixing a subject that is now the chief concern of my countrymen in a clearer light, I shall have the satisfaction of thinking my time and pains well employed. To proceed then. There is a certain proportionate quantity of money requisite, yes, to carry on the trade of a country freely and currently, more than which would be of no advantage in trade, and less, if much less, exceedingly detrimental to it. Absolutely true. But how much more? How much less? What is the quantity? This is the thing that needs to be resolved. But that's a beautiful paragraph. This leads us to the following general considerations. First, a great want of money in any trading country occasions interest to be at a very high rate. Well, so it may be, but that's not necessarily how it ought to be at all, because we haven't justified this interest thing. So what is wrong here with this sentence? How has he jumped from this astute observation to here? He's assumed, like all of us have, that interest is justified, and now he's just going to discuss what's purportedly economy in respect to this presupposition that interest has been justified. And where, oh where can that justification be when it's paid to mere publishers of evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, who don't even deserve to collect the principal, much less the interest? And it may be observed, he goes on, that it is impossible by any laws to restrain men from giving and receiving exorbitant interest where money is suitably scarce. For he that wants money will find out ways to give 10% when he cannot have it for less, although the law forbids to take more than 6%. Well, here he's relating to my, this relates to my long term paper, which is interest is usury. So what's basically demonstrated by these two sentences here is that Franklin did not understand that the obfuscation of the currency perpetually multiplied artificial indebtedness in proportion to capacity to pay until we suffered terminal failure. And he, like many, is presuming that 6% is interest is ostensibly permissible or legal, even as we're suffering less than that right now, and we're experiencing it, multiplying a phenomenal sum of debt into insoluble terminal debt. So he's not correct in these things, and he's obviously he's by his own pen giving away the fact that he's accepted the traditional definitions of inflation and or interest and usury as if there was a difference, even though, as my paper proves, even moderate rates of interest, any rate of interest which has to be borrowed to maintain a vital circulation, inherently and irreversibly multiplies artificial indebtedness into terminal failure. So we see right here already that Franklin doesn't understand these things. Now, he couldn't have provided a solution in the bank then, because, and how do we know that? Again, the explanation tells us the money was subject to interest, and here we are, and there we are, just probing for the principles. We haven't ascertained them to exactly whatever they are. Now, if we go back in time and study the words of Christ and whatnot, how was interest expressed in these ancient languages? Very simply, and in terms that which couldn't possibly even have distinguished between a permissible rate of interest and an impermissible rate of interest, which we formerly called usury. How can we say that? Because each were given as just in expressions which equate to in English as, quote, and more, unquote. So basic that we have to deduce what that would have meant. Now, is it proper to apply the term interest, or is it proper, that is 6% or less or whatever, by some process that's never been defined, or qualified, we decided is usurious above that? Well, that's stupid, because any rate of interest which has to be borrowed to maintain a vital circulation, 0.5%, eventually multiplies artificial indebtedness into a terminal sum of debt, which is, by definition, a usurious sum of debt. So these things can't even be. Now, I would stop here reading this because it can't teach me. Because I'm interested in Franklin, I would continue on further, perhaps, to get this under my belt. I've read the paper many times. But anyway, I will continue for your benefit. Now, the interest of money being high is prejudicial to a country several ways. These are just general observations. It makes land bear a low price, really, because few men will lay out their money in land when they can make a much greater profit. He's advocating unearned profit, by lending it out upon interest. So he's concurring, that's an effect. Is it terminal? Not a hint of a thought of it. And much less will men be inclined to venture their money at sea when they can, without risk or hazard, have a great and certain profit by keeping it at home. Thus trade is discouraged. Well, these are assumptions, and obviously not conclusive ones. And if in two neighboring countries the traders of one, by reason of a greater plenty of money, can borrow it to trade with at lower rate than the traders of the other, they will infallibly have the advantage and get the greatest part of that trade into their own hands. For he that trades with money, he hath borrowed at 8 or 10%, cannot hold market with him that borrows at his money at 6 or 4. Well, no shit, Shino. Which raises a further question. Well, how do you compete with mathematically perfected economy then, which eradicates interest? But do we want to suffer unearned profit? That's a question. On the contrary, a plentiful currency will occasion interest to be low, and this will be an inducement to many to lay out their money in lands rather than put it out to use. So he's assuming that it's going to drive up prices. Let's just continue on kind of quickly. Secondly, want of money in a country reduces the price of that part of its I don't know if you really want to go through this. To tell you the truth, this is getting really boring right now because you can see what he's doing. He goes on paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, just simply presuming that, the few effects that he's more or less put his 23-year-old finger on are accountable for all effects when